Welcome back, everyone, to week 15, and this will be our final topic for the semester. We have finally reached the European Middle Ages, and I have been waiting for this moment the entire semester. The European Middle Ages are some of the most fascinating um, eras to look at. And I say eras because we're looking at about 1,000 years of history, which historians have just dubbed the middle part. And so we're going to delve in deep and kind of look at all of the artistic and architectural developments of this time period. And so we're going to start with this piece right here. And this is from a book of hours. And a book of hours was a small book that was produced for the very wealthy. So this one was part of the collection of the Duc de Berry, and the Duc de Berry was a very wealthy early art collector. And so these books would have been illustrated with passages from the Bible. Also, they were also like sort of almanacs and all sorts of different things that were included in these books, but primarily they were books for worship, and they would have been painted with these beautiful illustrations to go with them. And of course, the wealthier you were, the better illustrations you got, and this gives you an idea of how wealthy the Duc de Berry was. And it tells us, what can this piece tell us about life in medieval Europe? Well, there's a couple things that we can look at. One, let's look at the very top part. So there's going to be an interest in the heavenly bodies. And what's fascinating that I discovered while I was doing my research in graduate school was that this was not a time when people didn't ask questions, when they didn't question the world around them. That's a very human thing to do. And so you do find scholars that are practicing astronomy and interacting with other scholars, say in Cordoba, to try to figure out what's going on in their world. However, their worldview is very much guided by their faith, and we're going to see that later on. Now, on the second half of the piece, we see a town. So we see the town walls. This is going to tell us the typical medieval town is going to be walled. And I do say town because they don't really grow into cities until the very end of the Middle Ages. And then at the center, we have a grand castle and a cathedral. And these are two of the different building types that we're going to be looking at. And at the very forefront, we have farmers. Now, these do not reflect the actual conditions of farmers during this time. This is a time of feudalism, and these people probably would not be wearing such bright, beautiful garments. They would probably be ratty and old, and life as a farmer in medieval Europe was not great. You were probably a serf, and these people lived in what we would call indentured servitude, which is just barely one step up above slavery. They were tied to the land. They were farmers. Most people in medieval Europe were farmers. They were not living in cities like we saw in ancient Rome or even in Constantinople. These were rural communities. And these farmers were tied to the land. They would farm them. However, they didn't get to keep any of the surplus that they farmed. They got to keep a little to eat themselves, but then they had to pay their lord for farming the land because the land was not theirs. They were paying rent on it. So it basically created a vicious cycle of poverty for most of the population of Europe during this time. Let's see. So medieval Europe. Let's get into our topic. So we have to pull back a little when we talk about medieval Europe because we did not really talk about the rise of Christianity. So here we have to go all the way back to ancient Rome and talk about the advent and the growth of Christianity as a world religion. So Christianity starts as a Jewish sect. So it comes out of the Jewish tradition. Its Messiah is Jesus. And to us, it seems strange that there would have been this man walking around the streets saying that he was the Son of God and that you should listen to him. But during this time in ancient Rome, in this particular region of the world, it was not that strange to have people walking around saying that they were sons of gods and that they were somehow messiahs. So it fits within the cultural tradition of that time period. And his teachings appealed, again, like Islam, to the poor and to women. And it didn't really take off until it opened its doors to non-Jews, because at the beginning you could only be Christian if you were Jewish, but it opens it up and suddenly it becomes incredibly popular. Again, because you have this idea that even though you live a wretched life, as most slaves and people in poverty and women lived, when you died, you could reach an everlasting kingdom. And it wasn't just an everlasting kingdom for the rich and the wealthy and the people that could build pyramids for themselves. This was a democratic, everlasting kingdom open to all, and especially the poor and the disenfranchised. So it took off like wildfire. Of course, it is adopted as the state religion for the Roman Empire. And because the Roman Empire spanned most of Europe is going to become Christianized. Now, when you have the barbaric invasions, those are going to occur. The Western Roman Empire is going to fall. However, we're going to see how those barbarians, the Visigoths, the Vandals, all of those groups, are then going to adopt Christianity themselves. And we get some of the most beautiful artwork that comes from that melding of Christianity and kind of these indigenous cultures of Europe. All right, so let's look at a timeline real quick. So the early Middle Ages, we usually say they span from around 500 to 1000. So you could say for 96 there, basically with the fall of the Roman Empire and up to the year 1000. And this is the period of the Byzantine Empire, which we already looked at, and the Romanesque. And it's called Romanesque because it's after the Roman style. That's basically what that means. And then you have the High Middle Ages. The High Middle Ages span from around year 1000 to 1250. And this is the period that most of you are thinking about when you think Middle Ages. This is like knights in shining armor and princesses and like courtly love, and all of those traditions come during kind of the High Middle Ages. And of course, a lot of that has been romanticized by the 19th century, but we'll get into that a little bit later. And then you have the late Middle Ages, which span from around 1250 to 1500. Now, this is the period of the late Gothic. I forgot to mention the early Gothic starts up in the High Middle Ages. However, these dates are very flexible because if you know anything about the Renaissance started in Italy in the 14th century. And I'm telling you here that the late Gothic goes into the 15th century. Well, if you're in Spain, remember, which was just reconquered in 1492, they are just starting to use the Gothic in Spain in around 1500. While in Italy, they moved on to Renaissance styles. So different styles are going to prevail at different time periods around Europe. All right, so here is a comparison map. So we left off before the fall of the Western Roman Empire. You had the Western Roman Empire. You had some small kingdoms here and there. You had the Huns, the Persian empires, and then the Eastern Roman Empire. By 800 CE, you have many other kingdoms established. Now, this is after a long period where all you had were almost city-states like we saw in Greece. They would fight amongst each other and kind of vie for power. At this point in 800 CE, you have most of the big players of Europe established. You have the Holy Roman Empire, you have the Umayyad Caliphate that we talked about last time, the Kingdom of France, the Kingdom of England, and of course the Byzantine Empire. Now let's talk a little bit about the Romanesque, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the Romanesque. Instead, I'm going to focus on the Gothic, but it might seem like the Gothic comes out of nowhere if you don't look at the Romanesque. So after the fall of the Roman Empire, what we are going to have in the West are very limited construction going on. The buildings are not particularly elegant in their construction. A lot of the information on how to build uh, kind of died off with the Romans. It got absorbed into the population, and they didn't really build at that scale because they didn't have the resources, they didn't have the technology available. And so we see a decline in the size and kind of the elegance of the engineering in the architecture up to the Romanesque. So in the Romanesque, we are going to see a need for ecclesiastical structures, and that means churches and convents and monasteries, that sort of thing. And we're going to see an expansion of religious orders and pilgrimage routes, and all of this is going to require new, grander architecture. And so the Romanesque can be described as unfortunately short and squatty, which sounds kind of horrible, but these buildings are actually quite beautiful when you go inside. As opposed to a large, looming Gothic structure, these spaces are more intimate, they're more personal, and in a way more powerful than those Gothic structures. But structurally, they could not do what the later Gothic architects are going to do. So these structures tend to be small. The walls tend to be very, very thick in order to support buttresses within the wall itself. The ceilings tend to be made out of wood, and the windows tend to be very small because they can't have large openings without all of it collapsing at this point. Now, this is an example of a Romanesque cathedral. Now, it is not a on the left, we don't have a Romanesque looking cathedral because the facade, meaning the front of it, and this happens a lot with cathedrals, was actually updated, and that is actually what we call Mediterranean Gothic. So in the south of Europe, the Gothic that we're going to look at later never really takes off because of the light qualities of the Mediterranean. And so you tend to have kind of a lighter, airier Gothic in Italy and parts of southern Spain and in other regions of the Mediterranean. Now, most of you know this space by that building in the background, so that is the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Now, the most important thing to remember about the Leaning Tower of Pisa when you leave this class is that it was not supposed to be leaning, because some people ask me that. And no, it was a structural mistake, and it started sinking, and so they just tried to fix it and they just left it leaning. But that is not the most important part. We are actually looking at the cathedral itself. I don't know how many pictures I've seen of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and I'm like, you didn't look at the cathedral? The cathedral's quite beautiful. And so here we have the inside of this Romanesque cathedral. You can see it's quite short. It doesn't soar above the sky as later Gothic cathedrals are going to. The columns themselves are quite thick. Everything's pretty blocky, and this is very characteristic of the Romanesque, and they tend to be very dark inside. So this part up here was added later. So this arch right here was added later. It would have originally just had a flat roof at the top here. This is another great example. So this is San Vincent de Cardona. and this is in Catalonia, I believe. And this is a great example. I mean, it's made out of brick, which was the material of choice in Catalonia, in this part of Spain, which has not under the control of the Umayyad dynasty. And they used a lot of brick, really thick walls, very small windows, not a lot of decoration on the outside. And you can see this is actually the crypt underneath the cathedral itself, because they would bury bodies underneath the cathedral. And this is not a great quality image, but it gives you an idea as to why these walls had to be so thick. The taller you build with this rounded arch, right? Because the Romanesque is still going to use that rounded arch, the more weight you put on these points, and eventually they will collapse. And so what they did was they just built really, really, really thick walls to support the weight, and they built the buttress within the wall. You're going to see how that changes in the Gothic. So we're going to skip over to Europe at around the year 1200 or so. And we're going to look at the Kingdom of France and the creation of the Gothic. So the Gothic spans from, as I said, around the 12th century to 14th centuries, although you can push that all the way to the 16th century in some regions. It is a style that develops in Western Europe. And as I mentioned, it begins in France specifically. And it begins with this particular structure. So this is Saint Denis, and it was created by Abbé Suger. And he wanted to create the most beautiful heavenly building for his God and for Jesus. And so here I am going to mention a little bit of what's going on culturally and what's going on in terms of faith. And for this, we have to understand the medieval worldview. And I am going to have you watch a video after this that delves a little bit into the medieval worldview, because it is very different than our own. Although these people had all of our humanness, our curiosity about the world, our worries, our insecurities, our, human needs, all of that. The way that they viewed the world was very different. This was a time period where not a lot was known about the world. You have to think that a lot of those developments in learning from ancient Greece and Rome and the Middle East, and then that were carried into Cordoba, right, by those Islamic empires, not a lot of that was getting to the lay people, so the people that were farming, the serfs. There were a couple of religious clerics that were really involved in academia and in studying the natural world during this time. But for most people, they didn't understand why things happened in their world. And so the best way to explain it was through their faith. And the example I'm going to bring up is, unfortunately, this time around, a little bit closer to home than when I usually teach this class. But that is the Great Bubonic Plague. So the bubonic plague reached Europe, and when it reached Europe, it was catastrophic. It was brought over on the Silk Roads, and wherever it hit, it destroyed, it decimated populations. We estimate that in one of these kind of journeys through Europe, it basically wiped out 2/3 of the population. Now, Europe's population was not huge during this time, but that is still a whole lot of people, right? And again, we can somewhat understand what these people were going through, but we know kind of what's going on, and we understand the idea of a virus and like what's causing it, the science behind it. For these people, they had no idea what was going on. They did not understand that this was a bacteria that was transmitted in a particular way and what you could do to avoid it. None of that. They just saw people dying in horrific ways. And so they felt like it was the end of the world. I mean, I'm sitting here and nowhere in that situation. And sometimes I wake up and I think it's the end of the world. And I'm sure you can all kind of commiserate with that feeling. And so people turn to their faith. And this was a time period when people genuinely believed that the end of the world was just right around the corner. So Armageddon was a real, tangible thing. You'll see in the video later on that people during this time also had a different relationship with the supernatural. The supernatural was part of their daily world in a way that the supernatural is not necessarily in our worldview, or at least in our Western kind of 21st century scientifically minded worldview, of course. So, and my point, the point I was originally trying to make before I went off on a tangent was that because of all of the horrific things that were going on in the world during this time, and by the way, the plague hit not just once, but it continued to hit Europe right up through the 18th century. So this was something that was with the population of Europe for a very long time. And because of this, again, they turned to their faith, and who can save them but God? And so they create these beautiful treasures for God as a plea to save them. And what we see here, of course, is a cathedral. This is an abbey, but a church. And of course, the church is the home of Christ. Some of the themes that we see over and over in architecture and art of this time is scenes from the life of the Bible and the life of Christ. Why? Because most people were illiterate during this time. They did not know how to read. And Mass was read in Latin, and most people did not speak Latin. And so you had no idea what was going on. And Mass was actually read in Latin in Catholic churches right up until the 50s, 60s. So if you have an older relative that was part of the Catholic Church, they can tell you all about how Mass was read in Latin and you just sat there and had no idea what was going on. And so they created these artworks in order to teach people about the life of Christ. So you often see images of saints, and there are saints for everything. And we are often going to see scenes from secular life through a religious lens. And I'll tell you what that means in a second. Some other developments of this time period: towns are going to slowly grow into cities. We're going to see the organization of guilds. And of course, those guild members are the artisans. Again, we haven't reached the point where people are calling themselves artists. They are artisans. We're going to see a centralization of power, and I showed that in that map of 800 CE, where these larger kingdoms are being established. And of course, the dominance of the Catholic Church. Now, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because I feel like you have covered this in 7th grade world history at some point. So, at the very top of the feudal system, you have the king, and the king has his nobles, usually his lords, and these lords manage the land. They have large swaths of land, and they have peasants that are tied to that land, as I mentioned earlier, that work the land, and they get to reap all of the benefits of that land. Now, although you have a king at the top, all of these nobles, all of these lords are always fighting each other. And so, in order to protect their land, they are going to hire knights. Now, knights are not the knight in shining armor that we were taught through Disney. Thank you, Disney. No, knights during this time were really more akin to mercenaries. They would change allegiance for money, and they were often, participants in quite brutal acts of violence when they were not fighting or on crusade, as it were. And so you have this warrior class, and then beneath them, you have the peasants, which would have been most of us, right? Like 99% of the population. And so we reach the three different types of buildings that we find in the Middle Ages. We have churches, and here we have an example of a Romanesque church. You can tell because it's short, it's made out of bricks, it has very small windows. Right? You have monasteries, and we'll talk more about monasteries in a minute. And lastly, you have castles. All right, so today I'm just going to cover monasteries, and next week I gave myself 2 weeks for the Middle Ages because I knew I was going to talk a lot. Next week we will look more closely at cathedrals themselves, and we will look as well at castles. So monasteries were centers of monastic life along with convents. So monasteries for men, convents for women. They were separated by gender. These were located outside of towns, and they're going to grow in size and population and in grandeur as the wealth rises within the Catholic Church. And they're often referred to as microcosms of the heavenly world. And what that means is they are tiny little replicas of the heavenly Jerusalem, of paradise itself. And that is what the medieval architects and town planners try to replicate on earth wherever you go. And so we'll see this next week. But whenever they were building towns, they were always referring to the heavenly Jerusalem, trying to replicate paradise on earth. Now, you might wonder why somebody would be drawn to a monastery or a convent, where these were spaces that offered liberty outside of what was a very rigid social and class structure. This means, for example, as a woman, you did not have a lot of freedoms or rights, and you switch from being the property of your father to being the property of your husband, and then you were basically obligated to have children until you basically died of childbirth, having your 14th child, which was not rare during that time, of course. If you were not interested in dying in childbirth, if you were not interested in marrying a man, if you were not interested in living that life, a convent was a great choice. These were communities of all women where you had more freedom. And most of the great women artists of the Middle Ages, I think Hildegard de Bingen, come from the convent life. Some of the great writers and poets of the time, they were all nuns. Similarly, with monasteries, if you did not want to participate in what was the very ordered life of being a farmer and then perhaps marrying a woman and having a gazillion children, a monastery might be your best choice. As well as if you were trying to move up the social hierarchy. And what's really fascinating about monasteries and convents is you had people of lower social classes mixing with nobles that decide to go into monastic life. And many men joined the church in order to move up the social ladder because perhaps they came from a noble family or perhaps a merchant family, but their best bet for social advancement was to join the church. You will have families like the Borgia or the Medici of later Renaissance period, where they came into power by moving up the social hierarchy of the church. Now, having said all that, of course, there were many people who were drawn to these spaces, these holy spaces, because of their faith. And I don't want to overlook that. All right, so I think, let me see. Okay, so I have one more slide here, and that is just to give you kind of a glimpse at what monastic life would be like. These were small cities in and of themselves. They were autosufficient, so they did not rely on any town or things like that. They had their own farm animals. They would have had several chapels, churches. They would have had cloisters, dorms, their own latrines, their own kitchen. They would often engage in different trades in order to also gain money. But of course, life was centered around the worship of God. But there were many other things that nuns and monks participated in. And one of those is illuminated manuscripts. So, one of the jobs of these monks that lived in these monasteries was to copy the Bible word by word, because there was no printing press at this time, of course. And so they would sit by a window because there's no artificial light, and they would copy the Bible over and over. And this is, of course, is also where we get our spacing in words. Before this, there was no standardized spacing between words. You can just write them all together. But monks in a monastery decided that that was really annoying, and so they started putting spaces between words. They also started creating these beautiful drawings to go with their writings, and these gave these monks the ability to express their creativity, and you get these beautiful passages. This is a from Paris, and all of this decoration on the outside, we call that ephemera, and those were really doodles that the monks would sketch into the corners of these Bibles. And often they are kind of grotesque or sometimes profane, because they just get really bored and they start doodling at the corner of their pages. And of course, the greatest illuminated manuscripts that we have come to us in the form of the Book of Kells. So these were done up in monasteries in Ireland, and we have an original here and one that's been digitally remastered so that you can see the brightness and the vibrancy and the intricate details that went into these type of art forms. Now, I'm going to wrap it up there for today. I feel like I've been talking a lot today. And we will continue with our exploration of medieval Europe in our next module.